I've got the power of a mail-in rebate. That is, it's Power Strike on Segaiden episode 68.
Nice beaver.
Thank you. I just had it stuffed.
Let me help you.
Ah, a shooter from Compile. The developer so powerful, so amazing, that the only way that Sega could contain them was to keep them out of retail stores. Yes, it's Power Strike, also known as Alesta, one of the rarest and most annoying Sega Master System games to find in its US incarnation. That's because the chuckleheads at Sega of America's marketing desk saw that they had the opportunity to counter Zanuck for NES with a direct parry and said, what if instead of making this incredible shooter easily accessible to all of our fans, we made it stupidly hard to come by instead? But don't take my word for it. You can see Sega's marketing genius in action for yourself by simply asking, what would Sega Visions say? Sega Visions, or rather Sega Challenge, said, if you want to play Power Strike, you'd better send in your form. Issue 4 of the company's free customer newsletter included an exclusive offer at the back, which presented players with the opportunity to buy a quote-unquote special edition cartridge not available in stores, Power Strike, right above that notorious Phantasy Star rebate offer that inspired so many players to mutilate their game boxes and remove the UPC. Sega's marketing team was really huffing something fun that month. The thing is, Sega didn't really do much of anything to sell readers on this exclusive game. Sega Challenge devotes about 2/3 of a page to the promotion, but there's no other coverage of Power Strike within the magazine. You'd think they'd have given it a spread of hype and tips, but no, it's just a quick one-time promotion for one of the finest shooters on the system. This resulted in arguably the strangest packaged release for Master System, a game that only the most diehard of Sega fanatics would have owned. Consider, Power Strike would have been ordered only by a subset of kids with money to burn sight unseen on a game, who would have been a subset of shooter enthusiasts, who were a subset of people who also subscribed to Sega Challenge, who were in turn a subset of Americans who owned a Master System in the first place. That's an awful lot of content filters. Power Strike's target audience could not have been big. I don't know how many copies of the game Sega of America actually manufactured, but apparently the game did receive a limited retail release in some capacity, if Sega Retro's write-up is anything to go by, so that would suggest that they produced quite a few more than they managed to sell through mail order. It even looks the part. In its Japanese, European, and Brazilian releases, Power Strike shipped in standard full-color boxes in each region's usual trade dress. In the US, however, Power Strike didn't formally appear at retail and therefore got the short end of the stick in terms of packaging. It only ever appeared in a monochromatic box. Technically a two-color box since it does have the standard Master System metallic grid printed behind the art, but the art itself looks like an ashcan monochrome pencil sketch of what I think is supposed to be a helmeted pilot in its fighter's cockpit, though the lack of color detail causes the helmet to look like a bull-style haircut at first glance, making this appear to be almost a sketch of Anakin Skywalker in a Naboo N1 starfighter. So much for originality, George Lucas. All of this makes it a sort of conceptually inverted precursor to Nintendo of America's wild overestimation of Dragon Warrior's popularity the following summer. In that case, Nintendo would massively overprint retail copies of the game, which they ended up giving away as a freebie mail order bonus. Honestly, it's hard to blame either company for misreading the room. I think that both Power Strike and Dragon Warrior speak to one of the challenges that game publishers had to overcome as they rebuilt the American console market from the fractured rubble of the Atari crash. Namely, figuring out which of the genres that had become explosively popular in Japan during America's wilderness years would stick to the wall here, too. Publishers had a pretty good handle on American tastes during the golden age before the crash. Given that video games started in America, consoles were primarily designed and manufactured in America, and most of the big hits of the era got their start with US developers. But once the Atari biz spiraled out, console games more or less disappeared as the medium's middle ground. You had arcades continuing to pump away quick, transient experiences, and you had computers appealing to older players with deeper, more involved experiences. Suddenly, though, consoles ceased to have a presence in the US for a few years. Those few years just happened to see massive leaps in game design and innovation taking place on Japanese consoles, especially Famicom. By the time the US console market became a going concern again, Japanese audiences had firmly established their enthusiasm for certain formats, with platformers, baseball sims, murder mystery adventures, role-playing games, and shooters dominating that country's sale charts and media. And some of those formats did pretty well for themselves over here, and American kids loved themselves a Mario alike, no question. Baseball? Heck yes, America's favorite pastime and all of that. But some of the other formats seemed to have a harder time sticking. When Power Strike arrived, we'd only just begun to see real RPGs translated for the US, courtesy of games like Phantasy Star and Zelda 2. The challenges there largely resulted from the difficult inconsistencies between the Japanese and English languages. Not just the fact that Japanese text takes more storage space than Japanese, but even down to little details, like the fact that English requires plural forms of words and Japanese doesn't, which has to be accounted for on a programming level. As for adventure games, forget it. Way too much text, and not nearly enough action for Americans. Publishers barely even made the effort to bring those games to consoles. And when they did, it was usually for games that got their start as English language titles in the first place, like Shadowgate, King's Quest, and Carmen Sandiego. Shooters, though, those seem like they should have been a sure hit here. By all appearances, games like Power Strike should have been incredibly popular in the US. Shooters tend to look cool, involve tons of action, and require very little mental power beyond sheer reflex and memorization. American gamers like all of those traits in their video games. And yet shooters never really took off on American consoles the way that they did in Japan and Europe. Nothing shootery would really dominate US console sales charts, at least not for another decade or so, when someone finally figured out twin-stick controls for first-person shooters. Which isn't to say that shooters hadn't had some cachet in the US to begin with. I've heard more than one person claim that the Atari 2600 port of Space Invaders sold so well that it single-handedly transformed the home console market here from a novelty into a business. And let's not forget Zaxxon, the first arcade game to have a television commercial. And Galaga, the game that frequently gets packaged alongside Ms. Pac-Man as the most enduring thing to have come from the year of our Lord, 1981. But our enjoyment of shooters does not begin to compare to Japan's voracious appetite for the format. I've covered this before. Space Invaders begat Galaxian, begat Galaga, begat Xevious, begat Star Force, begat Star Soldier, begat Zanuck, begat the Manic Shooter, forever and ever, amen. But just because we here at the NES Works Foundation love to clown about the influence of Xevious on Japanese game design, doesn't mean it's not true. Part of that has to do with the fact that Japan's collective love of Space Invaders never really died, and Xevious helped evolve that concept to a new tier of excellence. And part of it has to do with the fact that Xevious shipped for Famicom during a very delicate and formative time in the history of home consoles in that region. As the American console market faded rapidly into dissolution, the Famicom had only just begun to experience explosive growth that would have made Atari in its prime jealous. Xevious hit just as the Famicom really took off and as new laws limited the amount of time kids could spend in arcades. Namco's Xevious port managed to present the fastest, smoothest, and most complex shooter that had ever been seen on consoles, and suddenly those arcade nuisance laws didn't sting so badly. Even if Japan's collective love for shooters had been in danger of waning at that moment, Xevious on Famicom guaranteed that wouldn't happen. Shooters, and specifically vertical shooters, became a thriving segment of the Famicom market, and then the PC Engine market, and the Mark III and Mega Drive market. Shooters became a testing ground where talented devs could really show off their chops, pushing a given console's hardware to do all kinds of wild things that really seemed like they should have been impossible. Like Solaris did on 2600, except these games were purchased by receptive and enthusiastic audiences. And Power Strike doesn't play anything like Solaris. This is another entry in the growing family of vertical 8-bit shooters, about half of which, or at least half of the good ones, came from Compile. You only need to play for a couple of seconds to spot Compile's handiwork. All of the company's shooting trademarks are present and accounted for. A vertical shooter, Power Strike scrolls quickly upward through 6 different settings, assuming you're good enough to survive to see them all. That, of course, is no trivial task, given that this is, after all, a Compile shooter. Power Strike, in the tried and tested Compile way, throws an endless pile of bad guys at you, daring you to avoid a staggering number of moving objects that mostly have the ability to kill you. As we've seen in previous Compile shooters here on this channel, the developer had an uncanny knack for filling the screen with far more things than you'd think possible on a given piece of hardware. In this case, the hardware in question is the Master System, which means that Power Strike feels even more hectic than Zanuck or the Guardian Legend. Well, actually, Power Strike began life as an MSX game, as so many of their quote-unquote Sega exclusives did, but moving from the older computer to the more visually capable console allowed the company to remove their limiters and go all out. Power Strike mostly plays the same as the MSX game. It drops an anime intro and omits the opening stage, which seems strange given the more capable hardware. Maybe the increased visual detail in backgrounds and ships ate up more memory? Or maybe publisher Sega just got cheap with the production and pulled a 2600 Pac-Man on Compile, giving them an undersized ROM to save a few cents per unit. Compile also tweaked some of the weapon mechanics in the move to Master System. Power Strike uses the familiar Compile 2-button dynamic in which one button controls your ship's standard forward weapon, and the other fires an alternate weapon that has unlimited ammunition, albeit with a time limit, but whose precise nature varies according to the weapon icons you collect. You can power up both of these offensive options, and you really need to, because the bad guys in Power Strike attack relentlessly. Some enemies will drop yellow icons that boost your main weapon into something less pathetic than its default form, while others drop icons numbered 1 through 8 that provide you with a secondary weapon based on the number. Collecting multiple consecutive icons of the same number will upgrade that secondary weapon through a couple of levels of enhanced power. This admittedly can be a little more difficult to accomplish here than in other shooters, not just because your secondary upgrades depend on enemies dropping the correct assortment of icons, but also because those icons float upward and scroll off the screen pretty quickly rather than scrolling down or hovering in place relative to your ship. It's a kind of weird and unfriendly choice in a game that's already pretty difficult. I think the idea may have been to encourage a risk-reward scheme that tempts you to fly upward into the scrum and expose yourself to greater danger in order to claim greater power, but that's not really necessary. Just playing Power Strike counts as exposing yourself to great danger. The thing about Power Strike is not just that you have to wade through tons of bad guys. The real challenge comes from the fact that you can't really predict how the bad guys in Power Strike will attack, because their actions are really reactions to the way you play. The better you play and the longer you survive, the more aggressively enemies try to counter your actions. It is, yes, AI, but not the stupid kind of AI that consumes the equivalent of a day's worth of the electricity used by an entire household in order to generate an eggnog recipe that tells you to substitute rubbing alcohol in place of rum. No, this is just simple, responsive machine learning that attempts to get the best of you by countering your actions, adjusting attack patterns to match yours. In other words, it's just dynamic difficulty. Something shooters have been doing since our old pal Xevious came along with its secret threat level counter. And of course, Compile had already dabbled in this idea with Xanac, a game that, like Power Strike, made its initial debut on MSX, where it shipped under the name Xanac AI. Power Strike refines and improves on the dynamic difficulty found in Xanac, making it a sort of de facto successor to that game. In some ways, you could see Power Strike as the culmination of Compile's work to date. The company had evolved out of a studio called Programmers 3, which had produced, among other projects, several SG-1000 ports of Sega's early arcade shooters, including Borderline and Insub. Programmers 3 also created several original shooters for MSX, including Devil's Heaven, AE, and EI. As Compile, they continued to plow that same furrow with a string of increasingly slick vertical and horizontal shooters, such as Final Justice, Zizalog, and Gulkov, before eventually arriving at Xanac AI. The fact that all of these shooters ran on MSX is not insignificant. It's easy to forget that despite its almost TurboGrafx 16-level graphics processor, the Master System still ran on the SG-1000 architecture, which was in turn very nearly identical to the MSX architecture. Which is to say that Power Strike probably required very few changes outside of visual enhancements to make its way to Master System, where it could run free and unbounded with smooth 60 frames per second scrolling and animation, as had been the case with the port of Golvelius. And just as Power Strike represented a technical liberation for Compile's shooter efforts, it also feels like a culmination of all of the company's mechanical ideas. From its numeric power-up system to its dual weapon design to its dynamic enemy patterns, Power Strike brings together a lot of different elements that Compile had been kicking around in its shooters for the past 5 years into a groundbreaking work. Power Strike wouldn't be the pinnacle of Compile's shooter design by any means. Compile made Power Strike sequels for years under its Japanese title Alesta until the company shut down. And even then, developer M2 dusted off the brand to create new Game Gear and arcade follow-ups in the year 2020, because M2 is just like that. Oh, and Compile also parlayed their success with Power Strike, or Alesta, into developing a PC Engine exclusive sequel to Xevious for Namco with Xevious the Fardrout Saga. But that's a story for another time, or rather, for a different Gaiden side video. In summary, it's all quite a legacy for a game that Sega of America more or less brushed under the rug here in the US. I guess they just didn't think Americans had the stomach for a full-fronter shooter assault like this. Next time on Segaiden, the Master System's full frontal assault continues with yet another pixel illustration of a bare-chested Sylvester Stallone.